Hello, everyone. This will be a quick review focusing on the Latin American topics that we covered in two different sections. So we'll go in order, but I'm just going to cover in this video Latin American topics, not East Asia, especially because I had less lecture notes. Oftentimes, I just did my lectures from memory um, using the readings. So I'll quickly go through the readings and show you what you need to know. So first of all, here's the module of the different resources for the Latin American section. You'll see there are some notes, notes for salsa, notes for Argentinian tango and Mexican mariachi, but then you have different readings, and that's what I'll be focusing on now. So the first thing we talked about was rumba, Cuban son, and salsa, which are all primarily from this more Latin American music textbook, and then additional material from this other textbook that I'll show. I also want to, okay, yeah, so first be aware that this here, official audio tracks for more text, these are YouTube links that are links to official recordings instead of recording files like I have otherwise. These four links, though, are to the typical recording files for the audio examples for the exam. So we'll get to these, especially these are tango examples. Chalamet is the textbook I used for tango. So we'll get back to that. But first, just be aware that when you click on this official audio tracks, you get to this document that just has links. You'll see there's a rumba link, Cuban son, salsa, and then for the Mexico section, son jarocho and mariachi. So it's all there. All right. So now, as far as the more textbook, let's just quickly go through the important points. Rumba. Rumba is the secular traditional percussion heavy dance form coming out of Eastern Cuba. It features a bunch of different percussion instruments, including congas, bongos, also the box that I mentioned, which is called the cajone, but you don't need to know that. But remember that I said that this was played oftentimes in street corners, on docks, um, Havana and Matanzas being port cities. There were various crates available. So the simple point is that people played percussion on what was available. And that becomes important when we talk about the two basic rhythmic patterns that are most prominent in rumba. So you have the clave pattern. See here a set of claves, claves, both the wooden sticks and the pattern. I'll let you read about this. You don't need to know the name Montuno here, but you do need to know the basic idea of the rhythmic pattern that's played on those clave sticks that happens in either a 2+3 syncopation or a 3+2. So 2+3 would be ba, 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 ba. I'm sorry. Ba, 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 ba. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Or 3+2 would be the other way that I was mistakenly doing it just a second ago. So 3+2. Ba, 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 ba. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. So that clave pattern is the adaptation of West African timelines into a more Western 4-beat meter instead of the 12-beat African meters. And that's really the core, just like a timeline functions in West African music. So that's the key connection between rumba and these other Cuban genres that evolved out of rumba and West African music. Then there's another repeated rhythmic pattern that this textbook doesn't focus on so much. We'll get back to that in a second. But we go on about the clave pattern, talks about that there are other things besides the drums and the crates. There's a gourd shaker, so you hear rattles. Otherwise, this just gives you a little bit of an idea of the rhythm, which you don't need to know this other than to understand that it's interlocking parts. And then you have the listening example, which goes to this YouTube link here. So you can find that connected to those YouTube links I was just talking about, but this will lead you through the listening example here. So you should listen to that. And that's the basics of this textbook for rumba. Now, this textbook, the important thing that the reason why I added is because here you have this extra part here, the palitos, which are the little sticks. We talked about this in class. Why do we focus on sticks? Because this pattern could be played on anything. Once you get to salsa with a whole ensemble, it's oftentimes played on the side of one of the drums, the timbales, but you could play it on anything. You could play it on a cymbal, you could play it on the side of a drum, you could play it on the side of boxes. So that's why it refers to sticks, because the point is it's a pattern. It doesn't really matter what you play it on. And I'm not going to go through the rhythm of it as much. We talked about it in class, but just be aware that it's another repeated rhythmic pattern like the clave. The clave is more central, then you also have this palitos pattern. And in this track from Bruno Nettle, which there is an audio file for, you can hear a rumba that has that palitos because the Robin Moore YouTube link recording doesn't have palitos in it. Okay, so the long and the short of rumba is that it's a secular dance style, social dancing. It's not religious. Um, it happened where parties could happen. It was often discouraged by the government and by the Cuban establishment. It was the music of the Afro-Cuban population, and it became very influential for future genres. So moving back to more, we briefly talked about Cuban son, and there's an example of that. That's important because it's our first big Latin American guitar style, which we'll get back to. And it's sort of the bridge between rumba and salsa. So you should read this little section on Cuban son, some basics. But I don't have a lot of details to bring up about it. I played Buena Vista Social Club, but as far as the audio examples, it's just this track here, which features guitar more prominently. Okay, so you can listen to that, but you should just be aware that Cuban son was this important genre that then led to salsa. With salsa, which really developed in the New York region among Cuban immigrants and Puerto Ricans in New York, you take the basic format and rhythmic structure of rumba, you take that clave pattern, a lot of the instruments like conga drums, etc., and then you also take some features of son, like a verse chorus sung pattern where there's um, the singer begins with verses and then um, begins with verses, then moves to a more call and response section, which is the more dance section. So going back to rumba quickly, that's the montuno. You don't need to know the name, but you should know that there's a section where the singer's more featured singing verses. Then we get to this back and forth call and response, and that's the more raucous dance section that can go on for a long time. And the rhythmic patterns are a little bit different during that section. So in salsa, we see that coming from rumba in the form of a salsa song. So you have various Latin percussion instruments, but you also have horns, so various wind instruments, brass instruments, trumpets, trombones, etc., and piano and double bass initially, or in any case, some bass, maybe in some bands, a bass guitar. So you have kind of a jazz ensemble, which is why it's very similar to Latin jazz. But it's a sung form, it's a dance form, so there's a salsa dance for it. And it features that clave pattern. So you'll hear clave patterns. Even sometimes you don't always hear the clave pattern, but the horn parts may emphasize the clave pattern. So let's see. Here's our salsa. We talked about Celia Cruz and Ray Barreto. I played a video of Celia Cruz. And here's the audio example, which once again is a YouTube link here. So listen to that. And yeah, you should basically understand that there's sections that are the more call and response vocal section, which have a slightly different rhythm in the percussion. Um, and you hear more bells like cowbells during that call and response section. That's the montuno coming from rumba, but I won't ask you the name montuno. And then otherwise, the singer is singing verses while the percussion does a different pattern. But a lot of the percussion comes directly from rumba. Okay. So that's our basics for the Cuban section, though I'm going very quickly here. So you should read these sections and make sure you understand the listening examples and the basic features of the music from these readings. But I do have some lecture notes here, so you'll see that I do mention the cowbell. I do mention that the rhythm is in a 4-beat rhythm, but with this clave pattern, 3+2 or 2+3. Um, and those would be the most important things. You can see a little bit about rumba and son here. You can cha-cha and mambo. These were various dance crazes that I didn't feature in class, so you don't have to worry so much about cha-cha and mambo. But here are a few basics about salsa in some brief notes. So we have that. Then let's move to tango, which I do have notes for. Remember here, I only briefly mentioned in the notes, the readings here from Kay Kaufman Chalamet's book go into more details about this. So you should look over the readings again. But I did talk about the figure of the urban cowboys. So the ranchero, or specifically a term you don't need to know, but in Argentina they call that the compadrito, which then became the urban gaucho, this figure that migrated from the rural areas to Buenos Aires and major cities, oftentimes was out of work, sometimes engaged in petty crime, and became this figure that's the male figure of tango. And um, spending time at brothels where there was sometimes competition for the affection of different women, and all these sorts of features that I talked about became part of the dance style of tango. So let's talk quickly. Let's look at the readings. You'll see that featured early on is the accordion, the bandoneon, which came from German immigrants. So we talked about that. You can remember some features of it here by the readings. And I talked about then the development of tango from the simple orchestra tipico to more advanced orchestras. So the first track, La Comparsita Tango 1917, which you see in the recordings I list here, 1917. So this audio example, which that listening guide corresponds to, this is in Chalamet. You see I always list by the last name, which textbook these audio examples refer to. So here you have audio files in the Brightspace itself. So we're first looking, you should listen again to the early tango track, which is instrumental. It's a dance track, and you hear what's called the orchestra tipico you see here. So two accordions, two violins, piano, bass. And we talked about how there's this very clear, regular beat. Bum, 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 bum. So we talked about that, how that's a dance style. Then I talked about how tango became, because it went to Paris and it became a dance craze there, the Argentinian elites started to be interested in it more and promoting it. And then it got on the radio, and then it became also, besides just a dancing style, a sung style, where you had singers like popular crooners of the day, like the Argentinian equivalent of Frank Sinatra, for instance, singing songs that were tango songs with lyrics now. So a little bit about that. And then our next listening example is the same track or the same basic song, but this time with lyrics and a new melody that the singer sings. Well, you hear the same core features in the instrumentation, but now there's a more full string ensemble. So you see it says strings. Well, that's a much more elaborate string ensemble than just the two violins in the previous track. So be aware of the evolution of tango. And then the third example, so that one in our guide here is Comparsita Tango Song, early 1930s, right? Then our final example was about, I mentioned Astor Piazzolla and how uh, he was a major figure in symphonic tango. So then there became concert halls, symphony orchestras, people um, making complicated tango suites for orchestra that were not supposed to be danced to. And so there's one more track. You don't have to listen to the whole thing, but be aware that there became a tango form that was not for dance at all. It was for concert music, listening in concert halls with a symphony orchestra, complicated suites. And that's what the final Adinos Nino New Tango is a representation of that. So that's the basics on tango. Then we got to our more recent section on son jarocho and mariachi music, and this should be pretty straightforward. The readings for son jarocho in this other more excerpt are very short. So just be aware that the primary ensemble is a harp and two guitar types. We mentioned how the guitar, when it came to Latin America, wasn't standardized yet. That happened in the 19th century. So you have these different guitar types. So you can listen to the link, La Bruja, for the Son Jarocho example, which is from Veracruz, a state on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And then there's a listening example here for that. And then you'll see that I have sections slashed out that you don't need to worry about. But for mariachi music, also a regional style from Jalisco, um, with horns and violins that play melody. So you don't need to know the name of the guitarron, but there are different guitar variations for that. And then this on compa, I didn't ask you to know the name compa, but we did talk about this rhythm. And the key thing here, it explains it right here in this paragraph that I have the arrow to. It's, that pattern 1 and 2 and 3 and 2, 5, bum, 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 which is this alternating syncopated rhythm that is the core rhythm of both. You hear it in son jarocho and in mariachi music. So there's a listening example. There's an extended section on tango here that I crossed out a lot because you don't need to know too much of it. You do want to know this section that I bracketed here about operatic vocal style. So there's this operatic style of singing in mariachi music. And then there's a listening guide for that song that we played, El Son de la Negra, which you can hear those various musical features in. And once again, there's a YouTube link for that. So that's the basics of the Latin American section. And there'll be another video later about East Asian music. Thank you.